"You're too old for this," he screamed, grabbing my collar at the hospital while I was lying in a bed with a broken hip. My own son Curtis, 52 years old, had his hands on me like I was some stranger on the street, shaking me and demanding that I sign papers that would give him my 200-acre farm in Valdosta, Georgia. The same farm where I'd raised him, where his mama Dorothy and I had worked our fingers to the bone for 60 years, where 3 generations of Washingtons had built something from nothing. If you've ever been attacked by your own child, if you know what it feels like when someone you raised puts their hands on you in anger, if you've ever had family try to steal everything you've worked for while you're at your most vulnerable, pull up that chair and listen close. Because this story's gonna show you that sometimes the people who think you're too weak to fight back are about to learn just how much fight an old man still has in him. I'm Samuel Washington, 78 years old, been farming in South Georgia my whole life. Started with nothing but 20 acres of red clay and a dream back in 1965, when banks wouldn't lend to black folks and neighbors wouldn't sell to us either. Built Washington farms into 200 acres of the finest peach orchards, peanut fields, and vegetable crops in Lowndes County. My Dorothy and we raised 4 children on that land, buried 2 of them too young, and watched the other 2 grow into adults we thought we could be proud of. That broken hip happened on a Tuesday morning in September, while I was checking the irrigation lines in the back 40. Stepped in a gopher hole, heard the bone snap like a dry branch, and laid there in the dirt for 3 hours before my farmhand Miguel found me. At 78, a broken hip isn't just an inconvenience. It's a death sentence if you don't handle it right. The ambulance ride to South Georgia Medical Center was the longest hour of my life, thinking about whether I'd ever see my farm again. The surgery went well enough, but recovery was going to take months. Curtis showed up the second day, not to check on my health or bring me flowers, but with a briefcase full of legal documents and a story about how the farm was too much responsibility for someone my age. Said he'd been talking to lawyers and accountants, and they all agreed that I should transition ownership while I was still alive to avoid probate complications. But Curtis had been circling like a vulture for years, ever since Dorothy passed and I started slowing down. He'd moved back to Valdosta after his latest business failure in Atlanta, claiming he wanted to help with the farm, but really just wanting to position himself to inherit everything. The problem was, Curtis had never worked a day in his life on that land, never understood what it meant to build something with your bare hands, never appreciated that some things are worth more than their market value. That morning when he grabbed my collar and screamed at me about being too old, that's when I knew this wasn't about helping me or protecting the family legacy. This was about greed, pure and simple, and a man who thought his daddy was too weak and too old to stop him from taking everything. But Curtis was about to learn something about underestimating old folks, and about what happens when you put your hands on someone who's got nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. And if you're sitting there wondering how a hospital room confrontation led to me not only keeping my entire farm, but getting a court judgment that made Curtis pay me damages for the rest of his life, well, hit that subscribe button on Grandpa's Diaries. Because this story's about to show you that sometimes the biggest mistake people make is thinking that age equals weakness. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone underestimate just how much fight you've got left in you. Curtis used to be my baby boy, the youngest of my 4 children. The one Dorothy spoiled rotten because he came along 10 years after we thought we were done having kids. While his older siblings, Marcus, Linda, and James, were working in the fields after school, Curtis was inside with his mama, doing homework at the kitchen table and dreaming about life beyond the farm. "That boy's got book smarts," Dorothy would say, "but he's missing the dirt under the fingernails wisdom that keeps a family grounded." I remember when Curtis was 16, standing in that same kitchen, telling us he was never gonna be a farmer like his daddy. "No offense, Dad," he said, "but I'm gonna make my money with my brain, not my back. This farm life isn't for me." Dorothy and I looked at each other across that old Formica table, both thinking the same thing. Every generation's got to find their own way, and maybe Curtis would bring something different to the family legacy. We supported his dreams, even when they cost us. Sent him to the University of Georgia, paid for his business degree, helped him start 3 different ventures over the years, a construction company that went bankrupt, a restaurant that failed within 2 years, and some kind of tech startup that never got off the ground. Every time Curtis came home broke and defeated, Dorothy would feed him her famous fried chicken and cornbread, and I'd slip him enough money to get back on his feet. "Son," I'd tell him during those kitchen table conversations, "failure ain't the end of the world. Your great-grandfather failed at sharecropping before he saved up enough to buy his first acre. Your mama failed at her first teaching job before she found her calling. The difference between successful folks and unsuccessful folks isn't whether they fail, it's whether they learn something and keep trying." But Curtis never seemed to learn the right lessons from his failures. Instead of recognizing that maybe he wasn't cut out for business ownership, or that maybe he needed to develop better judgment about partners and markets, he always blamed external factors. Bad timing, dishonest partners, economic conditions beyond his control. It was never his fault, never his responsibility, never his lack of preparation or poor decision-making. After Dorothy died 3 years ago from complications related to diabetes, Curtis started coming around the farm more often. At first, I was grateful for the company and the help. The man was 52 years old, finally mature enough to appreciate what his parents had built, finally ready to contribute to the family legacy instead of just taking from it. He'd help with the bookkeeping, drive me to medical appointments, handle some of the administrative work that was getting harder for me to manage. But somewhere along the way, Curtis's helpfulness turned into something else. He started making comments about how much work the farm required, how expensive the equipment maintenance was, how difficult it would be for me to keep up with everything as I got older. "Dad," he'd say, "you're 78 years old. Most men your age are playing checkers at the senior center, not trying to manage 200 acres of crops and livestock." The conversations became more frequent and more pointed. Curtis would bring articles about elderly farmers who'd been injured or killed in equipment accidents, stories about families who'd lost their land because aging parents couldn't keep up with mortgage payments or property taxes. "I'm not trying to scare you, Dad," he'd say, "but I am trying to be realistic about the challenges you're facing." The first real warning sign came about 6 months before my accident, when Curtis brought his friend Bradley Mitchell to dinner at the farmhouse. Bradley was a real estate developer from Atlanta, the kind of smooth-talking white man who wore expensive suits and spoke in percentages and profit margins. I should have known something was wrong the moment Curtis introduced him as someone who specializes in agricultural property transitions. "Mr. Washington," Bradley said over Dorothy's cornbread recipe that I'd finally learned to make myself, "your son's been telling me about this beautiful property. 200 acres in South Georgia. Established orchards, prime agricultural land. This is exactly the kind of asset that could provide significant financial security for your retirement years." I listened politely while Bradley explained his company's services, how they helped elderly farmers monetize their assets through sale-leaseback arrangements, conservation easements, and strategic partnerships with larger agricultural corporations. Every sentence was wrapped in concern for my well-being and financial security, but underneath all the fancy language, he was talking about ways to separate me from my land. "The beauty of these arrangements," Bradley continued, "is that you can maintain your residence and even continue farming operations while accessing the equity you've built up over decades. Think of it as letting your land work for you, instead of you working for your land." Curtis was nodding along enthusiastically, asking questions about timelines and tax implications, like he was already convinced this was the right path forward. But I'd been listening to land speculators and development schemes for 60 years, and I knew a con job when I heard one. These men weren't interested in my financial security. They were interested in prime real estate that could be developed into subdivisions or shopping centers. "Gentlemen," I said, setting down my coffee cup with enough force to make them both look at me, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but this land isn't for sale. It wasn't for sale when my daddy bought it. It wasn't for sale when the county tried to condemn it for a highway project in 1987. And it's not for sale now." The atmosphere in that dining room changed immediately. Bradley's smile became more forced, and Curtis looked embarrassed, like I'd just failed some kind of test he'd set up for me. "Dad," Curtis said, Nobody's talking about selling the farm. We're just exploring options that might make your life easier. But I could see the frustration in Curtis's eyes. The same look he'd had as a child when I wouldn't let him quit his chores or skip church or give up on something that was hard. The difference was that now he was a grown man who thought he knew better than his father, who thought age had made me incapable of making smart decisions about my own property. After Bradley left, Curtis and I had our first real argument about the farm's future. "Dad, you're being stubborn," he said, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "You can't run this place forever, and you're not getting any younger. What happens if you have a heart attack out in those fields? What happens if you fall and break a hip?" The irony of that last question wasn't lost on me 6 months later when I was lying in a hospital bed with exactly that injury. But at the time, I just saw a son who was trying to push his father into a decision that benefited Curtis more than it benefited me. "Son," I said, "when the time comes for me to step down, I'll know it. And when that time comes, I'll make decisions about this farm that honor your mama's memory and protect the legacy we built together. But that time isn't now, and those decisions aren't yours to make." The broken hip changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Instead of bringing out Curtis's protective instincts or his filial devotion, it seemed to activate something predatory in him, like he saw my injury as an opportunity rather than a crisis. He showed up at the hospital the day after my surgery with legal documents instead of flowers, wearing a suit instead of work clothes, looking more like a lawyer than a son. "Dad," he said, pulling a chair close to my hospital bed, "we need to talk about the farm while you're recovering. The doctors say you'll be in physical therapy for months, maybe longer, and somebody needs to handle the day-to-day operations." I was still groggy from the pain medication, still processing the reality that my farming days might be over, but I wasn't so far gone that I couldn't recognize the smell of an ambush. Curtis had that same tone he'd used as a teenager when he was about to ask for money or permission to do something he knew I wouldn't approve of. "The harvest is coming up," he continued, "and Miguel can't handle everything by himself. I've been talking to some agricultural management companies, people who specialize in temporary oversight of farming operations. They could step in immediately, handle the business side of things while you focus on getting better." Agricultural management companies. That was a new euphemism for the same land-grabbing scheme Bradley Mitchell had pitched 6 months earlier. But this time, Curtis was using my injury as leverage, making it sound like I didn't have a choice, like signing over control of my farm was a medical necessity rather than a financial opportunity for him. "I don't need a management company," I said, my voice still weak from the anesthesia. "Miguel's been running the day-to-day operations for 15 years, and Marcus can help with the business side if needed." That's when Curtis's mask slipped for the first time. "Marcus doesn't know anything about modern farming techniques or agricultural finance," he snapped. "He's been working at the post office for 30 years. What does he know about crop yields and profit margins?" The truth was coming out now. This wasn't about helping me or protecting the farm. This was about Curtis positioning himself as the only qualified heir, the only son smart enough to handle the family legacy. Never mind that Marcus had been helping with farm finances for years, or that he'd grown up working those fields just like Curtis had. In Curtis's mind, his business degree made him more qualified than his older brother's lifetime of actual farming experience. "Curtis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not signing anything while I'm laid up in this hospital bed. When I get home and get my bearings, we can sit down and talk about what kind of help I might need." That's when he exploded. "Dad, you don't understand. The bills don't stop coming just because you're in the hospital. The property taxes are due next month. The equipment loans need servicing, and there are insurance claims to file for your medical expenses. Somebody needs to have legal authority to handle these things, and it can't wait until you feel like dealing with it." He was standing over my bed now, waving those legal documents like weapons, his voice getting louder with every sentence. Other patients and their families were starting to stare, and I could see a nurse heading toward our room with a concerned expression. "You're too old for this," Curtis shouted, grabbing my hospital gown by the collar and shaking me. "You're too stubborn and too old to see that you need help. Sign these papers and let someone who knows what they're doing take care of business." The physical assault lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My own son, the baby I'd rocked to sleep and taught to ride a bicycle and walk down the aisle at his wedding, had put his hands on me in anger, had grabbed me while I was helpless in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery, unable to defend myself or fight back. The nurse who witnessed Curtis grabbing my collar was a young black woman named Jennifer Mills, and the look of horror on her face told me that what had just happened was as shocking to her as it was to me. She immediately called for security and summoned my doctor, while Curtis stood there trying to explain that it was just a family disagreement, and he hadn't meant to get physical. "Sir," Nurse Mills said, her voice firm and professional, "you need to leave this room immediately. Hospital security is on the way, and if you don't leave voluntarily, you'll be escorted out and banned from the premises." Curtis looked at me lying in that bed, probably expecting me to defend him or minimize what had just happened, but I just stared back at him with what I hoped was the coldest expression I could manage. "You heard the nurse, son. You need to go." "Dad, come on," he said, his voice suddenly pleading, like he was just realizing the magnitude of what he'd done. "I didn't mean to grab you like that. I was just frustrated, trying to make you understand how serious this situation is." But it was too late for explanations or apologies. Something fundamental had broken between us the moment he put his hands on me. Something that couldn't be fixed with words or excuses. A man who would physically assault his 78-year-old father in a hospital bed wasn't a son anymore. He was a predator, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. After Curtis left, Dr. Chen came to check on me, and I told him exactly what had happened. He documented everything in my medical records, and Nurse Mills filed an incident report with hospital administration. Within an hour, I was talking to a social worker about elder abuse resources and legal protections for elderly patients. "Mr. Washington," the social worker said, "what happened to you today constitutes assault and battery, regardless of the family relationship. The hospital has security footage of the incident, and we're required to report it to Adult Protective Services. Do you want to press charges?" 6 months earlier, I might have hesitated to take legal action against my own son. Family problems were supposed to stay in the family, and involving the police felt like a betrayal of everything Dorothy and I had taught our children about loyalty and forgiveness. But lying in that hospital bed, feeling the bruises forming on my chest where Curtis had grabbed me, I realized that some betrayals can't be forgiven, and some behavior can't be tolerated, even from family. "Yes," I said, "I want to press charges." The next few days were a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and medical evaluations. My oldest son, Marcus, drove down from Atlanta, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief when I told him what Curtis had done. "Dad, I can't believe he put his hands on you. Curtis has always been selfish, but I never thought he'd hurt you." The assault charges were just the beginning. When the police investigated Curtis's activities leading up to the hospital incident, they discovered he'd already signed preliminary agreements with Bradley Mitchell's development company, promising them access to my property once he gained power of attorney. He'd been shopping my farm to developers while telling me he was trying to protect it. I hired David Brooks, the best elder law attorney in South Georgia, and we filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Curtis for assault, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. We also filed restraining orders to keep him away from me and the farm, and injunctions to prevent any unauthorized transactions involving my property. "Mr. Washington," David told me, "your son made a critical error when he put his hands on you in front of witnesses. That physical assault gives us grounds for criminal charges and civil damages that go far beyond just protecting your property." The trial took place 4 months later, after I'd recovered from my hip surgery and was walking with a cane, but otherwise back to my normal routines. Curtis had hired his own lawyer, an expensive-looking man from Atlanta, who tried to portray the whole thing as a misunderstanding between a concerned son and a stubborn father who wasn't thinking clearly about his own best interests. Judge Patricia Williams, a stern African-American woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a farm herself, wasn't buying any of it. She'd reviewed the security footage from the hospital, read the police reports, and examined all the evidence about Curtis's secret dealings with the development company. "Mr. Curtis Washington," she said, looking at my son over her reading glasses, Are you seriously asking this court to believe that physically assaulting your elderly father in a hospital bed was somehow in his best interests? Curtis's lawyer tried to argue that the assault was minimal, that no serious injuries had occurred, that family disputes shouldn't be handled in criminal court. But Judge Williams had seen enough elder abuse cases to recognize the pattern. Adult children who saw their aging parents as obstacles to inheritance rather than people deserving of respect and protection. The evidence was overwhelming. The hospital security footage showed Curtis grabbing my collar and shaking me while I was helpless in bed. The incident reports documented his threatening behavior toward nursing staff. The financial records revealed his secret negotiations with developers, planning to profit from my property without my knowledge or consent. But the most damning evidence came from Curtis himself. Under cross-examination, David Brooks got him to admit that he'd never actually worked the farm, never contributed to its success, never shown any interest in agricultural operations until he realized how valuable the land had become. "So let me understand this correctly," David said, pacing in front of the witness stand. "You want the court to give you control over 200 acres of farmland that you've never farmed, built by a father you physically assaulted, so you can sell it to developers who will destroy everything your family built over 60 years. "That's not how I would characterize it," Curtis replied, but his voice was weak, defensive. "How would you characterize physically grabbing your 78-year-old father while he was recovering from surgery?" Curtis's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen him for exactly what he was, a grown man who thought inheritance was more important than integrity, who thought his father's age made him weak enough to victimize. Judge Williams didn't just rule in my favor. She made Curtis an example. "This court has rarely seen such a clear case of elder abuse motivated by pure greed," she said. "Mr. Curtis Washington, you are hereby ordered to pay your father $150,000 in damages for assault and attempted fraud. You are permanently restrained from contact with your father or his property, and you are banned from inheriting any portion of the Washington family estate." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Curtis's expensive lawyer shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. My son had gambled everything on the assumption that I was too old and too weak to fight back. And he'd lost everything: his inheritance, his relationship with his father, and his reputation in the community. But the best part of Judge Williams' ruling came at the end, when she addressed the question of the farm's future. "Mr. Samuel Washington," she said, "this court recognizes your right to dispose of your property as you see fit, free from intimidation or coercion. Your farm will remain under your complete control, and this court will ensure that no one can threaten that control again." 2 years have passed since that courtroom victory, and Washington Farms is thriving under the management structure I set up with Judge Williams's blessing. Marcus took early retirement from the Postal Service to help with operations, working alongside Miguel and our small crew of seasonal workers. We've expanded the peach orchards, diversified into organic vegetables, and started a small farmers market that brings the community together every Saturday morning. Curtis never appealed the judgment, never tried to contact me, never acknowledged that what he did was wrong. The last I heard, he'd moved to Florida and was working for someone else's construction company, probably telling people that his crazy old father cut him off for no good reason. Some people never learn the lessons that life tries to teach them, and Curtis appears to be one of those people. The $150,000 judgment he was ordered to pay has been coming in monthly installments for 2 years now, and I've used every penny to improve the farm. New irrigation systems, updated equipment, soil conservation projects that will benefit the land for decades to come. It's fitting that Curtis's greed is funding the very legacy he tried to destroy. My will has been updated to reflect everything that happened. Marcus will inherit the farm, along with detailed instructions about maintaining its agricultural character and community connections. My grandsons and granddaughters will have opportunities to learn farming if they're interested, but no pressure to continue in agriculture if they find other callings. Most importantly, I've established the Dorothy Washington Agricultural Scholarship Fund, which provides college assistance to rural students who want to study farming, agricultural science, or rural development. Curtis's assault and attempted theft inadvertently created a legacy that will help young people for generations, which I think Dorothy would find both ironic and appropriate. I learned something important during those months of legal battles and family conflict. Age doesn't equal weakness, and experience doesn't equal obsolescence. Curtis thought my 78 years made me an easy target, someone who could be intimidated and manipulated into giving up everything I'd worked for. Instead, those 78 years had given me the wisdom to recognize a con job, the network to fight back effectively, and the determination to protect what mattered most. The farm is peaceful now, filled with the sounds of tractors and irrigation systems rather than arguments and legal threats. My great-grandson Samuel, Marcus's boy, comes out most weekends to help with chores and learn about the land his ancestors built. He's 16 years old, the same age Curtis was when he announced he'd never be a farmer. But little Samuel has dirt under his fingernails and respect in his heart. "Great-granddad," he asked me last Saturday while we were checking the peach trees, "do you ever regret what happened with Uncle Curtis?" I thought about that question while we walked the rows of trees that Dorothy and I had planted 40 years ago, trees that are still producing fruit for families across South Georgia. "Son," I finally said, "I regret that Curtis chose greed over gratitude, but I don't regret standing up for myself when he did." Sometimes the hardest thing about getting older isn't your body slowing down. It's watching people you love reveal who they really are when they think you're too weak to do anything about it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had family members assume that your age made you vulnerable to their schemes? Have you ever had to choose between family peace and protecting what you've worked for? Have you ever discovered that standing up for yourself, even against family, was the most important fight of your life? And if this story reminded you that age brings wisdom and strength rather than weakness and vulnerability, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about fighting back when people underestimate you, about protecting what matters most, and about learning that sometimes the people who think they can take advantage of you are about to get the education of their lives. Age might slow down your legs, but it strengthens your backbone, and sometimes that backbone is exactly what you need to win the fight that matters most. I'll see you next week with another cup of coffee and another lesson about never letting anyone convince you that you're too old to defend what's yours.